She is not his real mother, doctor, and she has absolutely no legal authority to sign that consent form. My mother-in-law delivered those exact words in a crowded preoperative hallway just 1 hour before my young stepson was scheduled for surgery. My husband was deployed thousands of miles away, and his parents thought they had timed their ambush perfectly. They looked at me and saw a temporary placeholder who would panic and fold under pressure. But they forgot that I used to run an Army Field Artillery Fire Direction Center. To understand how we ended up in a freezing standoff outside an operating room, I have to go back. My name is Elena. I am 32 years old, and before I ever packed a superhero lunchbox or memorized the drop-off schedule for a pediatric dental clinic, I spent 6 years in the United States Army. I was a non-commissioned officer. My specific job title was Field Artillery Fire Direction Specialist. When most people hear the phrase field artillery, they usually picture the gun line. They picture massive cannons shaking earth and pure deafening chaos. But my job was completely different. My job was inside the Fire Direction Center, a cramped tactical operations tent where forward observers sent us frantic radio transmissions from miles away. Inside that tent, there is absolutely no room for panic. My team had to take raw data from a chaotic battlefield and turn it into perfect lethal mathematics. We calculated grid coordinates, elevation, barometric pressure, wind speed, and powder temperatures. One wrong number, one rushed equation could cost lives. When the radio is screaming and the commander is demanding an immediate firing solution, you don't let adrenaline take the wheel. You rely on your training, facts over feelings. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. You learn how to completely detach from the emotional weight of a crisis so you can solve the literal problem in front of you. I carried that discipline with me when I took off the uniform for the final time. I transitioned into a quiet civilian logistics career, and that was when I met Michael. Michael was an active duty Army aviation mechanic. He was a quiet, steady man with grease permanently etched into his hands, a warm smile, and 2 little boys who were the absolute center of his universe. Noah was 6, and Leo was 4. Their biological mother had stepped away from the family years earlier, overwhelmed by the grueling, unpredictable demands of military life. She legally signed away her rights and moved across the country to start over, leaving Michael to hold his boys together through sheer grit and determination. He balanced late nights on the flight line with early morning preschool drop-offs. When Michael and I fell in love, I didn't just marry him. I married his squad. I gladly gave up my own civilian career trajectory to become a full-time stepmother. I became the anchor they desperately needed. I wasn't their mother by blood, but I was the one who checked under their beds for monsters every single night. I was the one who memorized the exact ratio of peanut butter to jelly that Leo preferred. I taught Noah how to ride his bicycle without training wheels in the driveway of our small house near Fort Bragg, running behind him until my lungs burned. We built a beautiful, structurally sound life together. But every secure perimeter has a weak point. Ours was Michael's parents. Arthur and Margaret lived 3 states away in a very affluent traditional suburb. They were wealthy, hyper-focused on social appearances, and utterly convinced they were the absolute authority on all family matters. From the first day Michael brought me to meet them, Margaret made her silent assessment of me. She looked at my plain clothes, my military background, and my lack of a prestigious family pedigree, and she categorized me immediately. To her, I wasn't a daughter-in-law. I was a temporary placeholder. I was a glorified babysitter occupying space until the real family could step back in. Margaret never raised her voice. She used the polite, relentless warfare of 1,000 tiny cuts. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a second to gently tap the like button. It really helps the channel find more people who appreciate a story about standing your ground. Whenever they came to visit our house in North Carolina, Margaret would walk through the front door, bypass me entirely, and kneel down to hug the boys. "Oh, it's so wonderful to see you," she would coo, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Did you miss your real family?" She would reorganize my kitchen cabinets without asking, moving my coffee mugs to the back simply because she preferred them out of sight. She would bring expensive, overly complicated toys that directly bypassed the rules Michael and I had established for the kids. And she always introduced me to her friends in the exact same tone of voice. "This is Elena," she would say, patting my arm lightly. "She watches the boys while Michael is working." She watches the boys, as if I were a neighborhood teenager who might wander off if left unattended. I never took the bait. Not because I was intimidated, but because I recognized her behavior for what it was. It was static on the radio. It was noise. I knew exactly what she and Arthur were doing. They were trying to draw fire. They wanted me to lose my temper, to scream, to act irrationally so they could run to Michael and prove that I was unstable and unfit to raise their grandchildren. Sometimes people expect you to scream when they push your buttons. Sometimes they expect you to shrink. I did neither. I remembered my training in the Fire Directions Center. The reality was that Noah and Leo loved me, and Michael trusted me implicitly. I just smiled, offered her a glass of iced tea, and let her passive aggression wash over me. Michael saw it, of course. He was fiercely protective of our family. Whenever Margaret crossed a line, he would pull her aside and deliver a stern, unwavering correction. Margaret would inevitably play the victim, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and claiming she only wanted to make sure her grandsons were properly cared for. Michael's interventions bought us temporary peace, but they never changed Margaret's core belief. She assumed that my authority existed solely because Michael was physically standing next to me. She believed that without his physical presence, I would crumble. She looked at me and saw a naive young woman playing house. That dramatic irony would eventually become her absolute undoing. For 3 years, that fragile perimeter held. But in the military, routine is always just a placeholder for the next upheaval. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in early October. Michael walked through the front door an hour past his usual time. He dropped his heavy canvas gear bag onto the floorboards with a dull thud. He looked at me, and I instantly recognized the flat, exhausted expression on his face. It was the look of a soldier who had just been handed a massive, life-altering change of mission. "We got the orders," Michael said softly, stepping into the kitchen. "The battalion is spinning up. A 9-month overseas rotation. I leave in 3 weeks." The air in the room seemed to vanish. 9 months is an eternity in the life of a 4-year-old child. But I nodded, poured him a fresh cup of dark coffee, and we sat down at the wooden table. Panic solves nothing. We had a household to secure. We had logistics to arrange. The next morning, Michael called his parents to give them the news. I was standing at the stove cooking breakfast while he had the phone on speaker resting on the counter. Michael delivered the deployment timeline. He explained the destination and the communication blackouts. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I expected Margaret to express concern for her son's safety. Instead, her voice crackled through the speaker, bright and suddenly energized. "Oh, Michael, don't you worry about a single thing here," Margaret said, her tone humming with sudden, undeniable triumph. "Arthur and I have already talked about this day. We will pack our bags this weekend. We'll come down and take the boys back to our house for the duration of the deployment. Elena can stay at the base and keep an eye on your property. We'll take over from here." Silence fell over the kitchen. I stopped stirring the pan. Michael stared at the phone. She wasn't offering assistance. She was declaring command. Michael didn't miss a single beat. He reached out, picked up the cell phone from the kitchen counter, and turned off the speaker function. "Mom," he said, His voice dropped into the quiet, absolute tone he normally reserved for correcting junior soldiers on the flight line. The boys are not leaving North Carolina. Their home is here. Their school is here. And most importantly, their mother is here. Elena is in command of this household while I am gone. Do not ever suggest replacing her again. I could hear the frantic, tinny sound of Margaret's voice bleeding through the receiver, trying to backtrack and reframe her hostile takeover as maternal concern. Michael didn't let her finish. He ended the call, set the device face down on the counter, and ran a heavy hand over his exhausted face. We both knew what had just happened. Margaret's mask had slipped. The polite warfare of passive aggression was officially over. Now that she knew Michael would be thousands of miles away, stripped of his ability to physically stand between us, she fully intended to exploit the opening. She saw an empty throne. She believed I was too weak to hold it. She is going to test every single boundary the minute my plane leaves the runway, Michael said quietly. Let her test them, I replied. I spent my 20s managing incoming artillery fire. A suburban mother-in-law is not going to break my perimeter. But Michael was an aviation mechanic. He didn't just hope things would hold together under stress. He built redundancies into the system. The very next afternoon, Michael told me to put on decent civilian clothes. We left the boys with a trusted neighbor and drove on to the military installation. But we didn't go to the deployment processing center or the medical clinic. We drove straight to the base legal assistance office. The military legal office is a fluorescent-lit, gray-carpeted waiting room filled with tired soldiers holding manila folders, trying to legally secure their entire lives before flying into combat zones. We sat across a heavy metal desk from an older, soft-spoken captain in the Judge Advocate General Corps. Michael leaned forward and outlined our exact family dynamic. He explained his parents' wealth, their assumed authority, and their very open disdain for my role in the children's lives. He told the captain he needed absolute, ironclad protection for me while he was deployed. If a medical emergency happens, Michael explained, I need to ensure that my parents cannot just swoop in, use their checkbook, and override Elena's decisions. I want a fortress around my kids. I want my wife to have the exact same authority I do. The captain nodded slowly. She didn't ask probing emotional questions. She recognized a soldier securing his supply lines. She pulled out a fresh stack of thick, watermarked legal paper. For the next 2 hours, Michael systematically transferred every ounce of his parental and administrative power directly into my hands. He didn't just sign a standard power of attorney. He signed a highly specific, heavily detailed medical power of attorney, granting me unilateral authority over any and all healthcare decisions for both Noah and Leo. But he didn't stop there. He also executed a formal, state-recognized, temporary second-parent guardianship agreement, explicitly naming me as the sole decision-maker in his physical absence. The language in the documents was extremely precise. It legally stated that under no circumstances were Arthur and Margaret granted temporary custody or decision-making authority. We watched the notary press her heavy metal seal onto the thick paper, leaving deep official grooves in the page. The sound of that metal embosser crunching into the paper was the loudest noise in the room. The captain slid the heavy packet across the desk. "Keep these originals secure," she told us. "Do not tell anyone you have them until the exact moment you need them." I took the envelope. It felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. It wasn't just paper. It was armor. When we got home, I slipped it into the zippered back pocket of my everyday canvas tote bag. Overconfident antagonists always get careless when they think you are defenseless. You don't broadcast your defensive measures to the enemy before they attack. You just wait. 3 weeks later, the deployment timeline hit 0. Standing on a freezing concrete tarmac in the pre-dawn darkness, the boys and I watched Michael walk up the steel ramp of a massive gray transport plane. He turned at the top, waved once, and disappeared. The engines whined. The massive aircraft lifted into the low clouds, and my 9-month solo mission officially began. For the first 2 months, the perimeter held perfectly. I kept the boys in a strict, loving routine. Margaret called every Sunday evening, her tone always saccharine, probing for weaknesses. She asked exactly what time the boys went to bed and exactly what I was feeding them. I answered her in the polite, neutral, unshakable tone of an automated weather broadcast. I gave her facts. I gave her no emotional traction. Frustrated, she usually hung up within 10 minutes. But then the unpredictable nature of raising small children handed Margaret her golden opportunity. In late January, our 4-year-old Leo developed a serious recurring issue with his tonsils. They were severely enlarged, causing him to snore heavily and miss critical sleep. After a consultation with a pediatric specialist, the verdict was clear. Leo needed a tonsillectomy. It is an incredibly common, low-risk outpatient surgery, but any procedure requiring general anesthesia for a 4-year-old is inherently stressful. I scheduled the surgery for a Thursday morning at the regional children's hospital in the city. I handled the initial insurance paperwork, signed the standard intake forms using my on-file authorization, and sent a heavily redacted email to Michael downrange to let him know everything was handled. Because I am not cruel, I called Margaret and Arthur a week before the surgery to inform them of the schedule. I expected a barrage of questions about the surgeon's credentials. Instead, Margaret's response was bizarrely calm. "Oh, a tonsillectomy," Margaret said over the phone, her voice entirely devoid of her usual frantic anxiety. "Yes, well, that is certainly a serious medical procedure. I suppose we will see what happens. Keep us updated." She hung up almost immediately. I stood in the kitchen staring at the receiver. My instincts flared. I had spent years analyzing patterns in a fire direction center. When a chaotic situation suddenly goes quiet for no logical reason, it doesn't mean the threat is gone. It means the target has shifted. The evening before the surgery, at precisely 7 o'clock, the phone rang. It was Arthur. "Elena," he said. His voice was brisk, authoritative, and entirely presumptuous. "Margaret and I have checked into a hotel near the hospital. We drove down this afternoon." I paused, holding a small hospital pajama shirt I had been folding. "Arthur, that really isn't necessary. It is a 2-hour procedure. He will be groggy, and I am just going to take him straight home to rest." "Nonsense," Arthur snapped, his tone shifting from polite to deeply patronizing. "He is our grandson. We have already spoken to the hospital administration this afternoon. We explained the situation with Michael being deployed. Since we are his biological blood relatives, they assured us we can handle the primary intake and the surgical consent forms." I stopped folding the shirt. "We will meet you at the surgical desk at 6 in the morning." Arthur continued, letting his assumption hang in the air. "Do not sign anything. We will handle things from here." He didn't wait for a response. The line clicked dead. They hadn't driven 5 hours just to sit in a waiting room and hold a stuffed animal. They had driven 5 hours to execute a hostile takeover. They believed they were walking into a hospital to take command of a vulnerable child from a glorified babysitter who had no legal standing. I didn't panic. I didn't call them back to argue. I simply looked over at my canvas tote bag resting by the front door. The heavy manila envelope was safely tucked inside the zippered pocket, completely out of sight. Sometimes you don't build a wall to keep people out. Sometimes you build a wall so they can run full speed into it. At 5:30 in the morning, the Regional Children's Hospital was a sprawling maze of pale blue walls and aggressive fluorescent lighting. The air smelled faintly of sterile floor wax and anxiety. I walked through the sliding glass entrance doors, carrying Leo, who was wrapped tightly in his favorite fleece blanket. He was incredibly groggy, completely unaware of the storm his grandparents were attempting to summon. I barely made it 20 steps past the main directory before they intercepted us. Margaret and Arthur were waiting directly in front of the main surgical registration desk. They had not taken seats in the designated family waiting area. Instead, they had physically positioned themselves like a barricade between the elevators and the intake counter. They were dressed in sharp, expensive clothing, projecting an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. When Margaret saw me carrying my stepson, she did not offer a soft smile. She did not ask how he was feeling. She walked briskly toward me, completely ignoring my presence, and reached her arms out to take him. "Here is our brave little boy," Margaret announced. She pitched her voice loudly, ensuring that the 3 nurses working behind the glass partition could hear her clearly. "Do not worry about a thing. Grandma and Grandpa are here to make sure everything is handled properly." Leo whimpered softly and buried his face deeper into my neck, his small fingers twisting into the fabric of my sweater. I did not step backward. I simply adjusted his weight on my hip and pivoted my shoulder slightly, seamlessly breaking her line of access without saying a single word. "Good morning, Margaret," I said evenly. "He is very tired. We are going straight to the intake desk to finish the paperwork." Margaret's forced theatrical smile vanished instantly. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, hostile slits. She had expected me to be intimidated by the sterile environment. She had expected me to hand the child over like a subordinate relinquishing a task to a manager. "Elena, let us not be difficult today," Margaret whispered sharply, stepping uncomfortably near. "This is a major hospital. This is not a playground permission slip. You are completely out of your depth. Arthur and I will handle the check-in and the surgical authorizations. The staff is already expecting us." She was employing a classic tactic of overwhelming force. Move fast, speak with absolute certainty, and assume the target will fold to avoid a public scene. But I was used to managing chaos. You do not match panic with panic. You just hold the line. "I appreciate you driving all this way," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "But I will handle the registration. You are welcome to sit in the waiting room." Before she could argue, a nurse behind the glass partition called Leo's last name. I walked past Margaret and approached the high counter. Margaret and Arthur followed immediately, matching my pace step for step. We arrived at the registration desk as a single, incredibly tense unit. The intake nurse, a weary woman wearing green scrubs, smiled at Leo and slid a heavy plastic clipboard across the counter. "Good morning," the nurse said gently. "I just need the primary guardian to review the final surgical consent forms and sign off on the anesthesia waivers before we can move him to the preoperative bay. The surgeon will be out in a moment to review the risks." I reached for the pen attached to the clipboard. Before my fingers could even brush the plastic barrel, Margaret's hand shot out. She slammed her palm down hard over the entire clipboard, trapping the consent forms under her heavy rings. The loud smack echoed sharply down the quiet hallway. 2 other parents across the room stopped talking and turned to stare. The intake nurse jumped, her eyes widening in sheer alarm. "Excuse me," Margaret said to the nurse, her voice dropping into a deadly, authoritative register. "She will not be signing anything." The nurse blinked, completely bewildered. "Ma'am, I need the parental consent before we can admit the child." Arthur stepped forward aggressively, squaring his shoulders to literally box me out from the desk. He spoke directly to the nurse, using his deep, booming voice to fill the space. "My son is currently deployed overseas in a combat zone with the United States Army," Arthur declared, intentionally weaponizing Michael's service. "We are the child's paternal grandparents. We drove down here specifically to ensure his medical care is handled properly by his biological family. This young woman is just his father's new wife." Hospitals operate on strict, uncompromising liability protocols. The moment 2 different parties stand at a desk and contest guardianship, the entire medical machinery grinds to a halt. A disputed consent form is a massive legal hazard. Margaret pulled her hand back from the clipboard and pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. If you appreciate stories about maintaining absolute bearing when someone tries to humiliate you, please take a quick second to tap the like button. It helps the channel reach more people who respect quiet discipline. "She is not his real mother, doctor, and she has absolutely no legal authority to sign that consent form." Margaret delivered the line with perfect theatrical volume, intentionally directing it past the nurse. I followed her gaze and saw the attending pediatric surgeon walking out from the swinging double doors. He was a tall, exhausted-looking man in blue scrubs, holding a digital tablet. He stopped dead in his tracks, taking in the standoff. The entire hallway went dead silent. This was the ambush. This was the moment they had plotted. They wanted to publicly humiliate me, strip me of my parental standing in front of medical professionals, and establish total dominance over the children's care. The surgeon approached the desk, his expression incredibly tense. When a family disputes custody or legal standing in the middle of a surgical intake, standard protocol is to freeze everything. You do not operate on a minor if the legal authority is unclear. "Is there a problem here?" the surgeon asked, looking between the charge nurse and Arthur. "No problem at all, doctor," Arthur said smoothly, pointing to the clipboard. "My wife and I are the biological grandparents. The father is deployed. We are taking responsibility for the surgical consent." The surgeon looked at me. He saw a young woman holding a sleepy toddler. He saw a wealthy, confident older couple demanding control. He hesitated. "Ma'am," the surgeon said, turning to me apologetically, "if there is a dispute regarding legal guardianship, I cannot proceed with the surgical prep. Hospital policy requires clear authorization from a legal guardian or a parent with established custody. If you are not the biological parent and you do not have legal documentation establishing your right to consent, the hospital legal department will completely shut us down." He trailed off, looking deeply uncomfortable. He was preparing to cancel the surgery. Margaret smiled. It was a small, terrifying, utterly victorious smile. She assumed I would panic. She assumed I would start crying or yelling or begging the hospital staff to listen to me. She was utterly convinced that I was just an unprepared civilian holding an empty bag. Margaret turned back to the frozen intake nurse, snapping her fingers once over the counter. "Give me the pen," Margaret demanded, her voice dripping with absolute authority. "I am assuming liability right now." The surgeon did not stop her. Instead, he turned his gaze slowly back to me, standing in the dead silence of the hallway, waiting to see if I was going to surrender my family and back down. The surgeon looked at me, waiting for the inevitable collapse. He expected me to cry, or to raise my voice, or to beg the intake nurse to listen to me. That was exactly what Margaret expected, too. She stood at the high counter, hand outstretched, practically glowing with the thrill of total dominance. She believed she had executed a flawless ambush. I looked at Margaret's extended hands, and I felt absolutely nothing. No panic, no fear, just the cold, mechanical clarity of a firing solution clicking into place. I remembered my time in the tactical operations tent. When incoming artillery fire threatens your position, you do not stand out in the open and scream at the sky. You secure your element, you verify your coordinates, and you calmly radio for counterfire. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. I did not reach for the pen. I did not engage Margaret at all. I gently shifted Leo's weight, pulling his small, warm body tighter against my chest. He was starting to stir, whining softly against the scratchy wool of my sweater, confused by the tense silence in the corridor. I kissed the top of his head, ignoring the hospital staff, ignoring my in-laws, and focusing entirely on securing my perimeter. Then I looked directly at the pediatric surgeon. "Doctor," I said. My voice was perfectly level. It did not shake. It was the calm, flat tone of a professional delivering a status report. "I understand the hospital has strict legal liability protocols regarding surgical consent. I respect that. Before anyone touches that clipboard, I need you to page the on-duty patient advocate to this desk immediately." The surgeon blinked, clearly startled by my total lack of hysteria. Ma'am, an advocate cannot magically change hospital policy. If you do not have legal standing, I am not asking them to change policy, I interrupted smoothly. I am asking them to verify it. Please page the advocate. Margaret let out a sharp theatrical scoff. She dropped her hand from the counter and rolled her eyes, turning to the surgeon with a deeply condescending smile. Oh, for heaven's sake, Margaret sighed, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Do not waste your staff's time with this theatrical nonsense, doctor. She is just embarrassed. She feels marginalized because she is only a stepmother, and she is trying to stall to save face. Let us just move forward with the paperwork. Arthur stepped closer to me, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into backing down. Elena, stop this absolute foolishness right now, he hissed, his face flushing a dull red. You are holding up my grandson's medical care out of pure, childish spite. You have no authority here. Walk away. I turned my body, completely boxing Arthur out of my physical space. Arthur, I said, quietly locking eyes with him. You are done talking. The flat, absolute command in my voice stopped him dead in his tracks. For 3 years, I had been the polite, deferential daughter-in-law. I had always smiled through their passive aggression. He had never heard the voice I used when a mission was on the line. He took a small half-step backward, genuinely shocked. The intake nurse, desperate to alleviate the agonizing tension at her desk, picked up the heavy red receiver of her internal telephone. She quickly dialed the administrative extension, spoke in hushed, frantic tones for a few seconds, and hung up. The senior advocate is on her way down from the 3rd floor, the nurse announced nervously. Perfect, I replied. For the next 7 minutes, the preoperative hallway felt like a vacuum. Margaret paced in a tight, agitated circle, loudly complaining to Arthur about the sheer audacity of my behavior. She was attempting to flood the zone with noise, hoping the uncomfortable public spectacle would force me to surrender. Arthur stood rigidly with his arms crossed, glaring at me, entirely convinced that this was just a pathetic delay tactic. They were so incredibly overconfident. Overconfident antagonists always get sloppy. They never consider that the silence of their target might actually be the silence of someone loading a weapon. I stood completely still. I focused on the rhythmic breathing of my stepson. I let them burn through their own energy. Finally, the heavy double doors near the elevator bank swung open. A tall, formidable woman wearing a dark navy blazer and a hospital security badge walked briskly toward the intake counter. Her name tag identified her as the Director of Patient Advocacy and Legal Compliance. She carried a blank legal pad, and her expression was a mask of practiced, unshakable neutrality. Her entire career consisted of untangling chaotic family disputes to protect the hospital from massive lawsuits. She stopped next to the surgeon, briefly conferring with him in whispers, before turning to address our fractured group. Good morning, the advocate said, her voice projecting crisp, professional authority. I understand there is a dispute regarding legal guardianship and surgical consent for this minor child. Arthur immediately seized the opening. He puffed out his chest and spoke directly to the advocate, entirely bypassing me. Yes, there is, Arthur boomed, pointing a heavy finger at me. My son is an active duty soldier currently deployed overseas. My wife and I drove 5 hours this morning to ensure our grandson receives his scheduled surgery. This young woman is just his father's new wife. She is completely hysterical. She has absolutely zero legal standing, and she is actively interfering with the medical consent process. We need her removed from this area so we can sign the paperwork. The advocate listened quietly, taking a single note on her pad. When Arthur finished, she turned her steady, appraising gaze to me. She looked at my plain jeans, my messy bun, and the tired toddler resting on my hip. She was used to dealing with frantic, terrified step-parents who thought love was enough to override bureaucracy. Ma'am, the advocate said gently, her tone laced with genuine pity. "I need to ask you directly. Are you the biological mother?" "No, I am not," I answered clearly. Margaret let out a loud, triumphant sigh. She actually clapped her hands together once. "There. Finally, she admits it. Now give me the pen." "Ma'am, wait," the advocate said, holding up a hand to stop Margaret. The advocate looked back at me, recognizing that my lack of panic was highly unusual. "Do you have any court-ordered custody documents granting you permanent guardianship?" "No," I said again. Arthur smirked. He uncrossed his arms and reached confidently for the clipboard resting on the counter. "Well, then that settles it. We are done here. Let us get on with it." "Arthur," I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the sterile air like a knife. Arthur froze his hand, hovering inches from the plastic clipboard. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached my free hand down to the canvas tote bag resting against my leg. I unzipped the hidden back compartment. I pulled out the heavy manila envelope. I did not shove it at the advocate. I did not throw it on the counter. I set it down gently, sliding it directly over the disputed surgical intake forms, completely blocking Arthur's access. My husband knew exactly what his parents would attempt to do the moment he deployed, I told the advocate, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. Which is why 3 weeks ago, he and I sat down with a military attorney from the Judge Advocate General office. Margaret stopped breathing. Her triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, creeping shadow of doubt. I tapped the heavy envelope with my index finger. "Inside this envelope," I continued, my voice cold and precise, "you will find a heavily detailed, state-recognized, temporary second-parent guardianship agreement. Attached directly to it is a fully executed medical power of attorney. Both documents were drafted by a military attorney, witnessed and sealed by a notary public." The advocate stopped looking at me. She set down her legal pad and pulled the heavy envelope toward her. "Those documents," I stated, letting every single word land heavily in the quiet corridor, "grant me absolute, unilateral authority over any and all medical, surgical, and administrative decisions for this child. They also contain a highly specific clause that explicitly revokes any assumed, implied, or emergency authority from the paternal grandparents." Arthur let out a loud, aggressive bark of laughter. It was a harsh, completely forced sound, designed to mask his sudden crushing panic. "This is ridiculous," Arthur boomed, pointing a shaking finger at the envelope. "She printed something off the internet. It is completely fraudulent. You cannot possibly accept a piece of paper she pulled out of a canvas bag over the word of the biological grandparents." The patient advocate ignored him completely. She opened the metal clasp of the envelope. She slid the thick stack of watermarked legal paper out and flattened it onto the intake counter. She opened the first page. The advocate read the bold, undeniable legal header. She scanned the precise, ironclad language drafted by the military legal office. Then she ran her thumb over the heavy, deeply grooved seal of the military notary public, pressed firmly into the bottom of the page. The polite, mediating neutrality on the advocate's face vanished instantly. Her expression shifted into something deadly serious. The silence in the hallway was no longer tense. It was absolute. The director of patient advocacy stood motionless at the high counter reading the documents. She did not skim. She meticulously reviewed the temporary second parent guardianship agreement, checked the dates on the medical power of attorney, and verified the deeply grooved notary seal pressed into the bottom of the final page. For 2 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the preoperative hallway was the crisp rustle of thick, watermarked paper being turned over. Hospitals deal with frantic, panicked families every single day. They are entirely accustomed to vague, emotional claims of authority printed on standard internet templates. But the paperwork Michael and I had secured at the base legal office was entirely different. It was armor-plated. It was drafted by a military attorney specifically trained to build indestructible legal fortresses around the dependents of deployed soldiers. When the advocate finished reading, she closed the heavy manila folder. She squared the edges of the paper precisely against the high intake counter, placed her hand flat over the stack, and looked up. She did not look at Margaret or Arthur. She looked directly at me. "Ma'am," the advocate said. The gentle, mediating tone she used to placate frantic families was completely gone. It was replaced by the cold, uncompromising authority of a hospital administrator recognizing absolute legal fact. These documents are perfectly in order. They are fully executed, currently active, and legally binding in this state. You are recognized by this hospital as the sole, undisputed medical decision-maker for this minor child. Margaret's mouth fell open. For a fraction of a second, the wealthy, composed, utterly dominant suburban matriarch vanished. She looked exactly like someone who had just stepped confidently off a sidewalk and suddenly found herself standing in the path of a speeding freight train. "I am sorry, what?" Margaret stammered. Her voice was suddenly high and reedy, completely stripped of its theatrical volume. "That is absolutely impossible. I demand to see those papers right now. You cannot possibly tell me that a piece of paper you pulled out of a canvas bag overrides a biological bloodline." The advocate physically shifted her body, placing herself directly between the documents and Margaret's reaching hand. "Ma'am, step back from this desk immediately," the advocate ordered. Her voice was no longer a polite suggestion. It was a concrete wall. "These are private legal documents. You are not authorized to view them. This hospital's legal department honors properly executed military powers of attorney without question." Arthur's face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. The entire illusion of his total dominance was shattering in real time, and he simply could not process the structural collapse. He leaned heavily over the counter, trying to physically impose his will on the situation one last time. "Listen to me very carefully," Arthur growled at the advocate, completely losing his temper. "I am going to call our family attorney right now. We are going to freeze this hospital in litigation for years. You are going to stop this intake process this second, or I will have your job by tomorrow morning." The advocate did not even flinch. She was a professional who spent her days managing angry, litigious people. She had absolutely zero patience for idle, bombastic threats. She simply turned her head and looked directly at the pediatric surgeon. "Doctor," the advocate said clearly, her voice carrying down the quiet corridor, "the stepmother has sole, unchallengeable legal authority. The hospital legal department will completely support you. The liability issue is resolved. You are cleared to proceed with the primary guardian's consent." The surgeon exhaled a massive, visible breath, the tension leaving his shoulders in an instant. The agonizing liability trap had been completely neutralized. "Understood," the surgeon said, turning his back on Arthur entirely. He picked up his digital tablet. The advocate then turned her attention back to my in-laws. She delivered the final devastating blow with flawless bureaucratic precision. "Sir," the advocate said to Arthur, pointing a single finger at the folder, "your son specifically named you and your wife in these legal documents. He included an entire addendum expressly revoking any assumed or emergency authority you might try to claim while he is deployed. He anticipated this exact interference." The reality of the situation finally crashed down on the grandparents. The public reckoning was absolute. They had not been humbled by screaming or by an emotional breakdown or by begging. They had been completely dismantled by a silent, perfectly executed contingency plan. They had walked into a hospital assuming I was a temporary placeholder, completely defenseless, without my husband standing physically beside me. They failed to realize that Michael had built an impenetrable fortress around me before he ever stepped onto that transport plane. He knew exactly who his parents were, and he trusted me to hold the line. Margaret stared at me, her chest heaving. The sheer, overwhelming humiliation of being formally dismissed by a hospital administrator in front of an entire waiting room of people was too much for her to process. She realized that I had not been paralyzed by fear when she demanded the pen. I had simply been waiting for her to step fully into the trap before I closed it. "Elena," Margaret whispered. Her voice was shaking with completely impotent rage and profound shock. "How could you do this? How could you intentionally humiliate your own family like this?" I looked at her. I thought about the 3 years of passive aggression. I thought about her calling me a glorified babysitter to her wealthy friends. I thought about the absolute cruelty of ambushing me in a hospital hallway an hour before a child's surgery. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. "I did not humiliate you, Margaret," I said quietly, maintaining unwavering eye contact. "I simply brought the paperwork. You did the rest." I turned away from them, effectively ending the conversation. I stepped up to the intake counter, picked up the pen, and smoothly signed my name on the final surgical consent forms. The intake nurse quickly processed the paperwork, her hands shaking slightly from the leftover adrenaline. She handed me a green visitor badge and gave me a deeply relieved smile. "All right, doctor," the nurse said, sliding the clipboard back to the surgeon. "We are ready to prep him." The surgeon stepped forward and pointed down the hallway toward the sliding glass doors. "Sir, ma'am," the surgeon commanded, finding his voice and asserting total control over his preoperative area. "This is a restricted medical environment. You have absolutely no legal standing here. Step away from the surgical desk, or I will have security remove you." Arthur stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing in silent defeat. Margaret began to weep. They were real, bitter tears of utter humiliation, completely stripped of her assumed power in a crowded hallway. I adjusted Leo on my hip, picked up my heavy canvas tote bag, and turned to follow the nurse toward the secure surgical wing. The heavy electronic locks clicked open. I walked past my in-laws. I did not look back. I carried my stepson through the heavy, double-swinging doors, and they clicked shut securely behind us. Arthur and Margaret were left standing alone in the public lobby. The hostile takeover had failed. They were completely stripped of their assumed power, locked on the outside of the sterile perimeter, waiting in terrified silence to see if I was going to permanently banish them from our lives. The surgical suite was completely quiet, orderly, and perfectly controlled. The operation itself took less than 45 minutes. When the attending surgeon came out to the private recovery room to give me the update, he looked at me with a profound, unspoken level of professional respect. He knew exactly what a chaotic family dynamic looked like, and he recognized exactly how I had managed to protect his surgical environment from a total meltdown. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in a dimly lit room, holding Leo as he slowly came out of the anesthesia. He was incredibly groggy, complaining softly about his throat and demanding endless cups of crushed ice. I fed him the ice chips with a tiny plastic spoon, completely focused on the immediate mission of his comfort. By late afternoon, the hospital formally discharged us. I strapped Leo securely into his car seat and drove the familiar route back to our quiet house near the military installation. Noah, our 6-year-old, was thrilled to have his brother home. We spent the evening eating cherry popsicles, watching animated movies on the living room sofa, and maintaining a strict, quiet perimeter. I did not answer any phone calls. I knew perfectly well that Arthur and Margaret were still sitting in their expensive hotel room near the hospital, drowning in complete silence. They were waiting for the massive, devastating retaliation they fully believed was coming. When you strip someone of power after they attempt a hostile takeover, they expect you to banish them entirely. They assume you will use your absolute victory to inflict maximum pain. Arthur and Margaret believed I would lock them out of the house, block their numbers, and completely sever their relationship with their grandchildren for the rest of the deployment. They believed this because that is exactly what they would have done if they had won the confrontation at the surgical desk. But I am not them, and revenge is terrible logistics. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, after Noah was asleep and Leo was resting comfortably, I picked up my cell phone. I dialed the hotel number. Margaret answered on the very first ring. "Hello," Margaret said. Her voice was thin, hesitant, and completely devoid of its usual arrogant command. She sounded terrified. "Margaret," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and entirely professional. "I am calling to give you a medical update. The surgery was entirely successful. There were absolutely no complications. Leo is resting quietly on the couch right now. He has already eaten 2 popsicles, and the doctor expects a full recovery." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Arthur breathing heavily in the background. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were waiting for me to scream, to gloat, or to deliver the final killing blow to their access. "Elena," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "Thank you. Thank you so much for calling us to tell us that. We honestly thought you were never going to speak to us again." "I know you did," I replied evenly. "Because you love him, and you know you overplayed your hand. But Margaret, listen to me very carefully." I let the silence hang for 3 full seconds. "I am not going to punish 2 small children just because their grandparents made a terrible, cruel decision this morning. You and Arthur can absolutely come visit him this weekend when he is feeling better. But the dynamic you brought into that hospital today is permanently over." Margaret sniffled softly. "I know. The next time you come to my house," I continued, "you will walk through the door understanding exactly who I am. I am not a temporary placeholder. I am not a glorified babysitter. I am the mother of this household. If you can accept that absolute reality, you will always be welcome in our lives. If you cannot, I will use those documents to shut you out entirely. Do we have a clear understanding?" "We understand," Margaret said quietly. And for the very first time since I met her, she meant it. I hung up the phone. The deployment lasted another 7 exhausting months. But the silent, brutal warfare of passive aggression was permanently over. Margaret never tried to reorganize my kitchen cabinets again. Arthur never tried to bypass my authority on a phone call. The absolute crushing defeat in that hospital hallway had fundamentally realigned the family dynamic. Sometimes the most devastating way to defeat an antagonist is not to completely ruin their lives. Sometimes the most powerful vindication is simply forcing them to recognize the reality they refused to see. I let Arthur and Margaret remain in our lives. Not because they deserved my forgiveness, but because my children deserved their grandparents. I simply rebuilt the boundaries with reinforced steel, and I never had to apologize for defending my position. If this story of holding the line resonated with you, I would deeply appreciate it if you left a comment below. Have you ever had to stand your ground against a family member who constantly underestimated your authority? How did you finally enforce your boundaries? Let me know in the comments. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you believe in quiet dignity and earned justice. It helps us bring you more stories about people who refuse to fold under pressure. In our next video, we follow a Navy nurse whose ex-husband tried to secretly manipulate her credit during a sea tour, completely forgetting that she had an airtight fraud alert system quietly running in the background. You will not want to miss that public reckoning. Thank you so much for being here with me. Trust your training, secure your perimeter, and I will see you in the next one.